I'm very glad to be back in Taipei again at a very interesting moment in history, because what's significant about our times is that we're probably going to experience greater change in the next 10, 20 years than we have in a long time in human history. Major changes are coming. What I hope to do today is to share with you my view on what these changes are, and also talk about the implications for Taiwan. And I must emphasize that I'm trying to speak to the people of Taiwan as a friend of Taiwan, because as you look around the world and you ask yourself which parts of the world can possibly suffer a great deal as a result of these changes, it's clear that there are some dangerous flashpoints in the world and some less dangerous, or frankly even relatively peaceful areas of the world. And if you had to do a list of some of the most dangerous areas in the world, by any objective calculation, Taiwan comes very high up on the list. So that's why it's very important for the people of Taiwan to understand clearly what is happening, especially in the field of geopolitics. And that's why I believe you call it the Geopolitical Summit. And then we can also talk about what the impact will be also of the US presidential election. So what I plan to do, therefore, in my remarks is to divide them into 5 parts. The first part, I hope to try and give you a broad overview of the big structural changes happening in the world. Part 2, I would like to talk about one particular contest, which actually has been mentioned in the opening remarks, that clearly will have an impact on Taiwan, which is the geopolitical contest between the United States and China. And thirdly, I want to discuss a question which I'm sure is at the back of your minds. Who's going to win? United States or China? And fourthly, I'll talk about what impact, if any, will there be on the relative choice of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris in this election. And finally, I hope to conclude by making some suggestions, hopefully helpful suggestions, on how Taiwan can navigate its way through treacherous waters. So let me begin in part 1 by talking about the larger structural changes. And it's important to emphasize here that these structural changes are phenomenal. I'll just give you one example, right? For the past 200 years, in one way or another, world history has been dominated by the West. Clearly. In fact, 100 years ago, every corner of the world was all colonized by Western powers. My ancestors come from India. In the year 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians. Isn't that stunning? Is that amazing? That was the world. That was the West. So Western power has continued for a very long time. But we are now clearly reaching the end of the era of Western domination of world history. But I hasten to add that the end of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. The West will still remain the single strongest civilization, still have an impact on the world, but its ability to dominate the world is disappearing. And I just to give you one concrete example. As you all know, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which as you all know, clearly was illegal under international law, many countries, in fact a majority of countries in the world, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in response to the invasion, the West imposed sanctions on Ukraine, thinking, hey, this is the right thing to do. And the international community will, of course, support the West in imposing sanctions on Ukraine. That would have been a natural thing that the West expected. But instead, 85% of the world's population did not follow the West in imposing sanctions on Russia. 85% of the world did not follow the West. So paradoxically, what the West thought was a move that would end up isolating Russia ended up actually in a move that showed the relative isolation of the West from the rest. And the waking up of what I call the global South, who, by the way, represent 88% of the world's population. The West only represents 12%. The 88% which were dormant for a long time have woken up. And so the texture, the chemistry of the world is changing as a result. And if you want to understand the scale of these changes, maybe let me compare it to something that you all understand. You all know that climate change is having a dramatic effect on our world, right? We're seeing all kinds of new weather phenomena emerge, droughts, hurricanes, typhoons, remarkable changes in the world. But that's what's happening in the physical sphere. But in the geopolitical sphere, we are also experiencing geopolitical climate change. Structural changes are taking place. And if structural changes are taking place, the most dangerous thing you could do is to go blind, sail blind, and pretend that the world isn't changing. And so for the people of Taiwan, when there's so many geopolitical shifts happening, you have to try and understand what they are and how they will impact you. Because as I started by saying, one of the most dangerous spots in the world is seen to be Taiwan. And to understand why, let me now go to part 2 of my remarks and talk about the biggest geopolitical contest, which is always the one within the world's number one power, which today is United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. And it is, I think everyone knows that a major geopolitical contest has broken out between US and China, and there's no question that it will accelerate over the next 10 years. And so Taiwan is clearly going to be affected by this because you're going to be a pawn in this contest. Pawns often get sacrificed, So it's important for pawns to be geopolitically adept and make sure they don't get into the line of fire. But of course, one thing that you need to do is to also understand what are the structural forces driving this contest. And I highlight 3 of them. One is, of course, what I call the iron law of geopolitics. Whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. This is like an iron law of geopolitics. But this is also something that is well known. I think CY may have mentioned Graham Allison has been here. He's written a book, Destined for War, in which he's done case study after case study of such power transitions. And most of the time, it leads, in his view, to contestation and often to wars. So what is therefore happening between US and China is predictable. It's not surprising, right? This is normal. But everyone talks about this. But the second structural force that is at play here in the US-China contest is one that no one talks about. In fact, I seem to be the only one speaking about it. And I call it the fear of the yellow peril. Now, the fear of the yellow peril, it's important to understand, has lain buried in the Western imagination for 800 years or so, ever since the Mongols almost conquered Europe. And this fear has surfaced in literature from time to time. Now, if you think that this is a figment of my imagination, I add a very important historical fact that 130 years ago, the United States Congress passed a piece of legislation called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. Why? The fear of the yellow peril. And the only reason why I emphasize this dimension is that you may think that in this contest between United States and China, that it will be driven by rationality and cold calculations. And that may not be bad, but it's also driven by emotions. And when it's driven by emotions, it can become more dangerous. And that's why you've got to be very, very careful managing this contest, because you've got to understand the emotions behind them and why this will drive the contest forward. And then the third structural force I mentioned is the ideological dimension, which is there. And the ideological dimension is expressed by virtually all American leaders when they say it's a contest between democracy and authoritarianism, right? And that may be in part a description of what is happening, but it's also necessary for American leaders to highlight that ideological dimension, because American leaders at the end of the day have to get the support of their population. To get the support of the population, they have to explain why this is a worthy cause for the United States to get involved in. And therefore they say, we must defend democracy against authoritarianism. And as you know, one way in which the United States won the Cold War against the Soviet Union is that it successfully managed to demonize the other side. And Ronald Reagan famously said that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. A simple phrase, but it made the Americans understand, this is what we are fighting against, the dark forces of authoritarianism. And therefore, a major effort, quite naturally, is being made to demonize China too, and that reflecting the ideological dimension. So for all these reasons, because of these structural forces, it's not difficult to make a prediction that the US-China contest will accelerate over the next 10 years. And it's also, by the way, at the same time, there's also a deeply held conviction in Washington, D.C., that the United States probably has about 10 years or so to stop China. Because the United States has calculated quite rationally that if China's economy continues to grow, if China becomes number one economy in the world, then things will change significantly. And so if you think you have 10 years, you will step up your measures against China, and that's what we will see. So all this leads to me, my third question: who will win this contest? Will it be the United States or will it be China? And if I wanted to be very mischievous, I would actually ask you all to raise your hands. But I won't. I won't be mischievous, because I've done this so many times. I know that when I give this speech to an American audience, and I go frequently to the United States. I was a visiting scholar at UPenn earlier this year. I'll be going to Harvard later this year. You can tell, for many Americans, the question doesn't even arise. Of course, if it's going to be a contest between the United States and China, United States will win. What's the question, right? It's inconceivable that China could even win this contest. But increasingly, when I give these speeches about US, China to Asian audiences, I find increasingly to many Asian audiences, the feeling is that it's China that is winning the contest. So I cannot obviously tell you who's going to win this contest, because what's amazing about this contest and what makes this contest really special is that we have never seen two powers with the size and scale of United States and China going at loggerheads with each other. The Soviet Union never came close to overtaking the American economy in the way that China is doing so. So it's different. And in both these societies have remarkable strengths. And I'll just mention perhaps three remarkable strengths of China and three remarkable strengths of the United States. And they are strong in very different ways. In the case of China, if I had to list three remarkable strengths, the first one I would mention, which is an obvious one, that it represents the world's oldest continuous civilization. Some say 5,000, some say 4,000 years old. But there's no question that China is the world's oldest continuous civilization. And if any civilization has shown its resilience over a long period of history, it is Chinese civilization. So when Americans say, oh, this is a contest between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, they get it all wrong. The Communist Party is a new element in the Chinese landscape, but Chinese civilization is an eternal feature of China. So that is the contest that the United States is undertaking. And the second advantage that China has is that its leaders are among the most motivated leaders in the world, because they all remember still vividly the century of humiliation that China suffered from 1842 to 1949. So quite often, when the West takes actions against China, many in the West are not even aware that they're reviving memories of the centuries of humiliation. And the more you revive the memories of the centuries of humiliation, the more you motivate the Chinese leaders to struggle even harder. And I can tell you that when Canada, in my view, unwisely detained the daughter of the founder of Huawei, I thought that was a huge mistake, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to remind the Chinese of the century of humiliation. And that motivation is a very powerful force in China. And the third remarkable strength that China has, as we all know, and it's strange that I should be saying it as an Indian to an audience which is primarily Chinese, that the Chinese are remarkable, resourceful people. So what they have accomplished in the last 30 to 40 years of growth is absolutely amazing. Now, as you know, right now, as you and I speak, there's a consensus in the Anglo-Saxon media that the China growth story has peaked. China cannot grow anymore. That is being bogged down by the real estate crisis, dampened business sentiments, lack of foreign investment. China growth story is over. And you know, anyone who has any sense of history will say that you just cannot switch off the energy of 1.4 billion people after the energy has been ignited. Even if the Chinese economy slows down for a few years, and it may slow down for a few years, its long-term growth trajectory is real. So I don't believe that the China growth story is over. So these are the forces driving China. Now, at the same time, the United States also is a remarkable society. And it is still the most successful society since human history began. What it has accomplished is amazing. And but the interesting thing is that it does so in ways that are very different from China. So the first remarkable strength that the United States has is that within the United States, you have an amazing process of Darwinian contestation in American society in every sphere. In politics, in economics, in culture, in every sphere. And this Darwinian contestation that goes on daily creates individuals who are amazingly strong. And that's why the United States can constantly create world-beating corporations, because it's a result of individuals constantly contesting each other. And of course, I'm sure you saw some of the contestation this morning in the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. But it's that process of contestation that makes America such a strong society. It keeps it going. And the second remarkable strength that United States has is that if China has access to 1.4 billion resourceful people, United States has access to 8 billion people. Because the best talents from all over the world, if they're looking for an opportunity, they try in one way or another to find their way to the United States. And they know that if they're good, if they're capable, they'll rise, they'll find the opportunities in American society. And that's why United States, in the United States, some of the largest corporations, in fact, some of the largest corporations, not just in the United States, but largest corporations in the world are run by people who are not born in the United States. So the head of Google, Sundar Pichai, was born in India. The head of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, born in India. So you have this incredible talent. And that's something that China cannot replicate. So that's a competitive advantage that the United States has. And the third remarkable strength that the US has is that it has a remarkable culture of innovation. That's why in the leading fields, it's always Americans that come out with breakthrough advances. And we've seen this just recently in the field of AI. And until 2-3 years ago, I remember people telling me, oh, China will have an advantage in AI. China's got these huge data pools. Then China will leap ahead. And lo and behold, United States leapt ahead in the field of AI. So that culture of innovation is amazing. And I can tell you, when I spent 2 weeks this year at the University of Pennsylvania, when you spend time in a leading American university, you can feel it. You can feel it. You can feel this drive, determination to excel and to do well. So these are all remarkable strengths, which is why future historians, when they look back at our time, will be amazed because they're seeing this contest between two remarkably strong and powerful societies. And so it's anybody's guess as to how it'll evolve. Now, so all this brings me to the next question. What difference does it make whether Kamala wins or Donald Trump wins? And here there's a paradox. On the one hand, I can confidently say nothing will change because this contest, as I explained earlier, is driven by structural forces, not by personalities. Whether it's Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, or anybody else, the US-China contest will continue. It's driven by structural forces. But on the other hand, everything may change because the style, and sometimes to some extent the substance of Trump's and Kamala's responses to this US-China contest clearly will be different in many significant ways. And I'm sure that if you are a leader of China trying to decide who's better for China, is it Donald Trump, is it Kamala, it's a very tough choice because both have their advantages and their disadvantages for China. And maybe that's one way of me spelling out the differences between the two from the point of view of China. How will China be impacted by Donald Trump or by Kamala Harris? So what are the advantages of Donald Trump for China? Well, the number one advantage is that unlike Joe Biden, and probably unlike Kamala Harris, who worked very hard to get the allies of the US to come along in this contest against China, and this is what the Biden administration is most proud of. They feel that this is no longer a contest between US, China. They've tried to get Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Europeans more involved in the contest against China. But as you know, Donald Trump doesn't believe that allies are assets. He believes that allies are liabilities. And so he's always asking, what have you done for me lately? And as you know, he tried to increase the spending by Japan and South Korea even in his first term. And when he comes back, he will probably insist that the allies pay more. That's going to alienate the allies. And I'm told that he may even ask Taiwan to pay more. So that's how he treats his friends and allies. So if he alienates allies, that's a plus for China. And the second thing about Donald Trump is that he's incredibly erratic. And because he's erratic, he will also alienate other countries. And in contrast between an erratic Donald Trump and a predictable China, countries will say, okay, I'd rather work with a predictable China than with an erratic Donald Trump. And so that's also a plus. And another possible plus that Donald Trump could provide is that he's a deal maker. He is prepared to sacrifice anything if it thinks it will be good for him and it will be good for the United States of America. So, and this is why Taiwan has got to be very careful. I mentioned earlier that you're a pawn. Taiwan will be easily sacrificed in a deal if something can be obtained in return for China. And geopolitics is a very cold and cruel business. Countries have been sacrificed, territories have been sacrificed consistently in geopolitics if you're not careful. And Donald Trump will have no hesitation. I mean, as you know, even in his first term, even though South Korea had been a very strong and close ally of the United States, he didn't even consult South Korea when he decided to go to North Korea. That's the kind of person he is. So that may be an asset. But of course, Donald Trump also poses dangers to China because, as you know, his Secretary of State in his first term was Mike Pompeo. And after Mike Pompeo stepped down, I understand he came to Taiwan to give a speech here. And in that speech, he recommended that the United States should recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now, Mike Pompeo is sophisticated enough to understand that that's a declaration of war. I'm surprised he recommended it. But if the United States was to recognize Taiwan as an independent country under Donald Trump, then Taiwan will be at war. So you can see, therefore, Donald Trump, why China may not be too enthusiastic about Donald Trump. Now, in the case of Kamala Harris, clearly, she's much more predictable, and you can expect to have a continuation of the policies of the Biden administration towards China. The pressure will be there, but it won't be erratic. It'll be predictable, and China can manage the predictable level of pressure. Kamala will, of course, keep the allies on board. That will be a disadvantage clearly for China. And Kamala, of course, will keep up the pressure on Russia and Ukraine. And she said so in the debate today. So in that sense, she will be just effectively a continuation of Joe Biden, but of course with a lot more energy and drive than Joe Biden had. So you can see from the Chinese point of view, there's no clear preference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and they will live with whoever is elected by the American people. So finally, I see I have about 3-4 minutes left. What should be the wisest thing for Taiwan to do? I think it's extremely important for Taiwan to be aware that at such a dangerous time like this, you got to be very careful with what you do. I know that there are people in Taiwan who believe that what will be good for Taiwan is independence of some kind. That would be dangerous under any circumstances, but it would be especially dangerous at a moment like this. Because if you walk into a room full of gas and you light a spark, you get a major explosion. So people who are pushing for independence have to understand the dangers. And there's also one paradox here. The goal of pushing for independence is to have greater freedom of action, to be able to do more things that you say you can do if you're independent. Effectively, though, if Taiwan pushes for independence, Taiwan is going to become more and more isolated globally. Because right now, one of the great benefits of being a Taiwanese is that you have a passport that is recognized and accepted 150, 160 countries around the world. But just imagine, if you push for independence, you force countries to decide, do I want to recognize Taiwan as independent? I guarantee you this, the majority of countries will not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. This is a geopolitical reality. So what you do, therefore, in pushing for independence is to lock yourself up into a small jail and throw the key away. Now, this may be a beautiful island to live in, but your capacity to travel and to engage the world will be diminished, especially now, because it's such a dangerous moment in history. I also know that people here who believe that perhaps you could go to the UN and get some support in some way or another. Having been an ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I can tell you that UN ambassadors are incredibly astute in their understanding of global geopolitics. They know what needs to be done. And they also know, many of them, if you force them to make a choice between China and Taiwan, there is no choice for them. Their ties with China have gone up by leaps and bounds, right? Take trade between China and Southeast Asia. In the year 2000, trade between US, China, and ASEAN was only $40 billion in 2000. By 2022, it had become $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. Southeast Asian countries cannot sacrifice $1 trillion in trade. A country like Brazil, that's far away. It took Brazil 20 years ago, 1 year, to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. And you're asking the Brazilians, choose. So therefore, it's very important if the people of Taiwan want to preserve the peace that they have had, you must understand what a complex, difficult geopolitical environment is arriving your way. Please be extremely alert. Please be extremely careful, because if you're not, the consequences can be very painful. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm CY Huang. It is my great honor and pleasure to moderate this session of a panel discussion. We just heard two excellent and outstanding speeches from two outstanding gentlemen, Professor Kishore Mahbubani and Professor Su Qi. And I think that gave a lot of lesson. I think today we have people from the business community, from academia, from government or ex-government. But I do hope that some of our government leaders will be here. That unfortunately they are not. But we have a lot of media attending today. So fortunately, so hopefully they will share some of the observation key points of today's the conclusion to our leaders. And this session, we have approximately 60 minutes. Because Kishore arrived in Taiwan last night, he has to go back to Singapore. Immediately after the session, you are all aware he's starting a Asia-wide book launching campaign. I hope some of them, if his new book will be Chinese version will be published at the end of October, but his previous book, he has China One, and also Su Qi's book, is available for sale outside at the book stand. And but this afternoon session, we have another guest who is a female, and she's equally outstanding, the most probably knowledgeable, capable, and charming lady I've known for a long time, Joanna Lei. And she, some of you might know her on the YouTube or some other program. She's a commentator, both domestically and on international occasion on geopolitical issues. So and this morning, I was amazed because we had an indoor, closed session, and Joanna was at the one hand participating in our panel, the closed-door discussion. On the other hand, following the U.S. presidential debate, at the end of the session, she gave us a summary of the presidential debate. So that truly demonstrates that she is indeed a 女超人, a Wonder Woman. And then she is, if you think Kamala Harris is any good, then you have the Taiwan Kamala Harris, Joanna Lei. May I asking you to say a comment, about the what you just observed on the first half. Thank you.
And thank you. When Paul invited me, he gave me a mission impossible. That is to say something smart, succinctly, in 10 minutes after two great minds. So in 10 minutes, I would try to do hopefully something that would add a little perspective to our discussion today. When we heard Kishore and Su Qi, they clearly laid out the world we're in. And I'd like to just add another perspective, which is geoeconomic rather than geopolitical. And hopefully that would bring our discussion to a full circle on what we are really observing. So for 10 minutes, I have some quick presentation for you. Next page. If we look at today, next page and the next page, the 2 pages are, am I to control myself? Who is going to help me? Maybe you can help me, just 10 minutes. If we look at the world today from a 500-mile perspective, there are 2 very clear wars in the world. One involves Europe, another involves the Middle East. Next one. And both will have huge impact, like Kishore saying, will have huge impact in our world and in the world order. Next page. So let's take a look. In addition to just having a tug of war point of view of how US and China are divvying power, let's take a look at a possibility that US-led world order is now at a bifurcation point. There are two different forces pulling the world. There are two polarizing forces. One is the traditional USA plus, which is geopolitical. You have something like NATO and the old TPP and so on and so forth. Another one is a new emerging force, which is PRC-led, PRC plus, which is primarily geoeconomic. One relies on geopolitical might, another relies on geoeconomic influences, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on and so forth. By definition, when you talk about geopolitical influences, it has to work in a mutually beneficial way. It has to work in consensus. And this new way of looking at the world, two different forces polarizing the world, will have a more diverse view on how the world may evolve. So now take a look at the 2024 election. In the United States, you may take Kamala or Trump in terms of their perspectives and how they plan to use government budget. So one would primarily focus on military and security. Another would probably focus on social issues and so on and so forth. This morning, we heard Kamala said what she intends to spend in terms of building back a middle class. But all of this will also have a huge impact on the already terrible deficit, which is about $35 trillion. And that particular deficit has some components. One is you have huge mandatory spending, Social Security and healthcare. Those are mandatory spending. Then after the mandatory spending, you do debt service and you have some discretionary spending. So where would you spend the discretionary spending would have a lot to do with the rest of us in terms of the world. And they would also have differential impacts on the United States domestically. Some would impact the rich, the haves, and some would impact the have-nots, the middle class to a lower middle class. So let's tie everything together. Yesterday, Peter Peterson is one of the foundations that I look at all the time. They issued a recent analysis from the Penn-Wharton budget model saying that the expected program by Kamala would increase the U.S. deficit by $1.2 trillion in the next 10 years, and the program by Trump would increase the deficit by $5.8 trillion in the next 10 years. So this is an economic perspective. This will impact how America can and would execute their geopolitical or geoeconomic programs. Next page, please. So I'm trying to lay out some more complicated things to make your life more interesting. In addition to the existing Pax Americana, which we all understand has a world order or the rule-based order primarily decided by the United States, the world is evolving into a multilateral order, and at least there are two major factors. One is the regional and multinational associations or alignments are getting increasingly more powerful, starting from RCEP to BRICS, to G20, to Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and to other regional organizations in the Gulf, in Africa, in Americas. So the regional forces are coming back, and by definition, it's the beginning of a multilateral order. The other one is the emerging hub and spoke alignments, not only with the United States as the hub, but also China as the new hub, which is the geoeconomic order. So the world is now a little bit more complex. The next page. Let's make it even more complex. There are new drivers moving our world forward. Technology and manufacturing capacity is changing, especially for digital AI migration, for the EV and the entire energy transformation, and the next frontiers. Nuclear fusion, quantum computing, space, and deep space. All of these are moving in front of our eyes. Then the second new drive is the world trade and new capital market is changing. It is increasingly flattened, and with a stronger platform-based economy, especially in the digital side, you would have the value redistribution. By that I mean, when you look at China price, China standard, and China platform, you would gradually have a world in which the resource provider, the manufacturer, and the branding companies' initiatives will gradually ease and shift the distribution of price and the distribution of value. The last one, very quickly, is you still have huge challenges, the existential challenge to human beings. Global warming or the pandemic all showed us in that new world, the lessons learned from the COVID is that we need to work together. We cannot be separated. We cannot imagine that we can separate the world and still resolve all these new challenges, the existential challenges to human beings. So next page. But there is a very clear inequality in distribution of wealth and inequality in distribution of value. This is the top 10 companies in the world by market cap. And I also added Tesla, though it's the 11th. In the top 10, you only have Saudi Arabia's Aramco, you'll have Berkshire Hathaway, and TSMC in the top 10. So the others are all American-based companies. Next page is even clearer. This is the multiplier effect of Wall Street. I looked at their revenues, their market cap, their price per share, but the most easy telling story is the PE ratio. You look at Apple. The PE ratio is at, well, I can see mine. PE is 34. Microsoft, 35. NVIDIA, 50. Alphabet, 22. Amazon, 42. Meta, 26. All of these companies enjoy huge PE in the capital market, and therefore they continue to be the richest, more wealthiest companies in the world and have the ability to continue to drive our future. Next. However, if you look at the economic, the manufacturing, the exchange of goods and services, while America believes that they can separate the world in giving you tariffs or sanctions, this chart was done by the next one. This chart was done by economists who calculated the interdependency. The blue one has a over 40% interdependency with China. And China, of course, doesn't have interdependency with itself, so it's yellow. When the United States tried to separate the two worlds, it has to address the symbiosis relationship between US and China, which is almost impossible to break at this time. Next page. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard two brilliant minds, and I'm trying to just add a little bit of geoeconomic forces currently at work. So my last three questions are to the brilliant minds and to the floor. With the two wars still in progress, can or how can Asia remain as a safe haven? Because Kishore kept saying we are living in the Asian century. And people sometimes branded him as pro-China. And I always think of Kishore as someone who is pro-Asia. And I think that's the best title for you. You believe that we don't have to follow the path of Europe, which now actually lost its autonomy or any hope of autonomy with the Ukrainian war. So can Asia be different? How do we get out of this bind and not be dragged into yet a third front? And would the safe haven different with the Trump perspective, which would be more militarily and security driven, or a Harris administration, even though Harris also showed extremely strong attitudes towards China must not be number one in the world. And they are unanimous in that consensus. The second question is for my own curiosity. While I promote geoeconomic forces as the new order and believe that it would eventually, quote unquote, eventually overtake the primacy of geopolitical forces. Because if you look at the world, political elites always believe that they can dictate the world, while economic elites and the world they created become our way of life. So eventually, geoeconomic order may overtake the primacy of geopolitical order. However, all the signs in our recent history seem to be on the opposite side. Trade and technology are weaponized, and all the world economic order as we believed it in the first decade of the 21st century, that everybody went into WTO, have now been dissipated and have been separated into different orders. So are we being too optimistic or are we simply being stupid? The third one is for everyone, especially we're talking about U.S. election today. U.S. is now the singular regional hegemon. This is Mearsheimer's thesis, right? U.S. is a regional hegemon, but there are no other regional hegemon. Or there's no opportunity for other regions to have their regional hegemon. So when U.S. is a singular regional hegemon, will this status last with the Trump or Harris administration? If yes, in what way, shape, or form? If no, when and where will we see the first crack? So with that, let me conclude. Please join me in thanking the two brilliant minds, and we have left them 3 huge questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, 这工作人员把这页留的啊，继续放在那页。Okay. Thank you for your brilliant summary of the and putting to the economic and the financial and technological aspect in addition to the geopolitical ones. You know, I think give us a perspective. I would on your third questions actually is the first. I'm going to ask Keisha. You know, basically you predict the rivalry between U.S. and China, and you say that U.S. is maybe ahead in 10 years, and then China will eventually catch up. And what the U.S. is trying to do is to prevent China catch up. You know, that is where the conflict coming from. And then last year, one of the Panther speakers, Graham Allison, in his book, the Destined for War, you know, what is that series? I don't know how to pronounce it. To say the C theory, you know, so the Destined for War, you know, but so back to this, you know, what is the end game? You know, what can you analyze for us? What is the U.S. trying to do at the end? Keep knocking China down, and what is China trying to do? And Xi Jinping recently said that he has no intention for become a superpower. He say Chinese is peace loving. You know, they have relations with a lot of other countries. They don't try to impose its own value to other countries. So maybe you can share some light with us about what U.S. trying to end in the end. What is China trying to end in the end?
First of all, let me begin by Joanna. I think that was an excellent presentation, and I'm glad you brought out the economic, financial, and technological dimensions, because they're also going to make the world a much more complicated place. And I think one statistic you provided that I think all of us should pay attention to is the size of the U.S. national debt, which is now already 125% of GNP, and debt servicing may soon cost more than the U.S. defense budget. And that will also eventually have geopolitical implications, because if the American people get tired of having to pay for this debt, and they have to choose between cutting down on internal commitments and external commitments, logically, the American people will say, we will keep our internal commitments, our social security, our entitlements, and we will cut our external commitments. And that, I think, will be Taiwan's nightmare 10 years from now. Because all of the policies, many of the policies of Taiwan are predicated on the basis that you will have the eternal support of one superpower. But that eternal support may not be eternal, may be time-bound. And if it goes away, which is a realistic possibility, what is your plan B? Every country in the world at a time of changing geopolitical, environment, you must have a plan A and you must have a plan B. Because if you only have plan A and it doesn't work and it crashes, then is a prescription for trouble. I think that's what your presentation brings up. Now, in the case of what is the ultimate goal of United States and China?
Yes, China.
And that's why I wrote my book, Has China Won? And, I wrote the book, you mentioned that I'm perceived to be pro-China. I'm actually pro-Singapore. And I'm trying to help both US and China navigate a better outcome. And in my book, Has China Won? It was Henry Kissinger who gave me the main insight, which is that the United States has launched a contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. So that there's no clear end game of the United States. And, essentially...
But now they have a strategy. They want to prevent China becoming number one. That's their strategy.
No. They have an attitude of wanting to prevent China from becoming number one. They don't have a strategy that spells out, I will do A, B, C, D, E, and then that will stop China from becoming number one. So, and that's what Kissinger is implying. If you just impose tariffs, any economist will tell you that when United States impose tariffs on Chinese products, China doesn't pay for the tariffs. American consumers pay for the tariffs. And the deficit hasn't gone down, right? So it hasn't worked. The efforts to stop China's technological development cannot succeed. And in fact, even The Economist came out with a cover story saying China is today a scientific superpower. So where is your strategy? What you have to, if you have a strategy, you got to document. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was successful because the United States cut off the Soviet Union from the rest of the world. And the Soviet Union then collapsed. China, and I'm glad you used the word geoeconomic, China is more integrated with the rest of the world than the US economy is. So the United States cannot isolate China. So, there's no clear practical goals that the United States has identified for itself. And as a friend of the United States, I would say, you don't have a game plan. Whereas by contrast, China does have a game plan. You mentioned BRI. Now, BRI was not designed by China out of any sense of altruism. China wasn't going out there with a big heart trying to save the world. China was doing something that is in China's long-term interests. To have countries have such deep connections with China that they won't give up they won't contain China. So whatever China has been doing, therefore, is part of a systematic, comprehensive strategy. And the United States, as of now, doesn't have a matching strategy. And so for the people of Taiwan, you got to figure out, in a contest between someone who has a strategy and someone who doesn't have a strategy, are you betting on the right horse? Right? So these are the sort of hard questions that you have to answer. And by the end of the day, I also believe that in the conclusion of my book, Has China Won? I emphasize that both the United States and China will be better off if they press the pause button on the US-China contest and focus instead on common global challenges, which you also mentioned, like climate change, like pandemics, and so on and so forth. So the end goal of all those of us who are not in the US-China contest should be to encourage both to find ways and means of getting along for the benefit of the global community.
So U.S. and China should find a way to cooperate rather than compete. Killing each other. And that's also what the cross strait Taiwan and China should do. So my next question to Suchi, Professor, is we know that Xi Jinping's goal is 和平统一, peaceful reunification, but we think we are moving away from that. The William Lai's insistence about the sovereign status of Taiwan, and that is now. That is getting very sensitive, So how and now, according to you, there are no dialogue, let alone cooperation. So how can we lead us to a peaceful reunification, please?
As I said in my PowerPoint, there are only two peaceful ways to unification, and one is already dead. One is already a dead end, and the other one is U.S.-China, and that depends more on U.S. and China. So I want to go back to Joanna's first question. That has to do with your question too, because without the U.S. now holds the key. U.S. is always the driver in U.S.-China relations. U.S. is still the superpower, the driver of the world, politically and economically. There's no doubt about that. And of course, peace in this region. So I think the question to ask is not what kind of policy, as your question, what kind of policy either one will take. The question is necessarily in this order. First, who is going to win? Harris or Trump? Secondly, by what margin? This question is oftentimes ignored, neglected. Third, what policy he or she will take. So this is the third question. But I think we should start from the first question. Who will win? Frankly, I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert. I'm not. And I don't even want to venture to guess. But what I do know is that second question, unfortunately, right now is more important than the first question, because the guy or the lady who wins will have to win big in order for the country, for the U.S., to return to normal life. If not, if Trump wins big or loses big, U.S., my hunch, plunge into some sort of disorder. Let me explain. The previous election, Trump lost by 3 million popular votes. And he claimed that all these 3 million are voted by the illegal immigrants. So next time, if he loses again by small margin, let's say 3 million, maybe a little more, he would say once again, my victory is stolen by Democrats. And his crowd would rise up in arms. There are 300 armed militias in the U.S. right now. 200 of them are Republican inclined, and 100 is Democrat inclined. And out of the violence committed in the last 3-4 years, again, 2/3, according to a U.S. police report, 2/3 are by the Republicans, armed militia. So if he wins, if he loses by small margin, U.S. will plunge into chaos and all over the country. I cannot predict where. So and we don't have to even talk about policy, because this question would consume our energy for quite a few months. And if he wins by small margin, let's assume Democrats will take it lying down. I'll live with it. Too bad. We accept the result. Then it's okay. If not, if the 100 armed militia inclined toward Democrats, if they would rise up somewhere, also smaller scale violence. But if the Democrats take it lying down, and Donald Trump will be very much a lot of people in the U.S. now calling him a dictator, and I agree. He will be a dictator because he will be untouchable. He would be an Iron Man, political Iron Man, 钢铁人. Nobody can touch him because he has brought together all the Republicans, all the people who were moderate, because they either kicked out or they gather around him. So this time I look at his campaign. The discipline shown by his campaign team is much better than previously, which means his control of his people is much more solid than before, which will go into his administration. He will not be treated as a child by McMaster, by Mark Milley, and the type. They treat him as a child. They need supervising by the adults. So he will be the adult. And again, if he happens to win one of the houses or the Senate, he would be even more powerful. Most importantly, the judiciary is 7-2 in his favor in the Supreme Court. So out of the three powers, he would have at least two. At least two. He will be dictator. He can do anything he wants. So what he will do, I think most likely he will, quote unquote, reform the federal government. I happen to have found a footnote. It's a small footnote in a very thick book. I happen to see it. It's done by it's a Bloomberg opinion survey, which asked 12,000 federal officials who donated to 2020 campaign. Asked them, whom did you donate to? 84%. Guess what? 84% to Biden, and not to Donald Trump. No wonder Donald Trump always suspected that there's a deep state. There's a deep state in federal government. 84%, not surprisingly. So at the same time, Democrats control media. I would estimate at least 85% of the media and academia, most of the elite universities, and entertainment, Hollywood, in the medical, medicine area. I mean, just about. I mean, Democrats really are in solid control of the country. So if he's voted into the administration, and I think he would have changed, revamp. So and of course on foreign policy, he will also be able to do whatever he wants, so the margin counts. But the problem with Donald Trump is that he just may, according to my understanding of the U.S. military, he just may split the U.S. military. It may sound surprising to most of you. U.S. military is a very disciplined, hardcore, seasoned, battle ready, and all that. But it just so happened in the past few years, not that long, 10 years, maybe 15 years, the war, aside from war fatigueness, there's a racial issue. So the whites, most of the white soldiers in the military are from the red states, the Midwestern. Like J.D. Vance is a good example. I mean, they had no hope. Only 4% of those white boys, poor white boys, have a chance to get into the large cities, and like J.D. Vance. Most of others stay in their hometown, jobless, drug abuse, and violence and all that. So those go into the military is the only salvation. So these white soldiers in the military are, I would surmise, pro-Trump. Unfortunately, the black and Latinos, to lesser extent, Latino men are half Republican, half Democrat, and Latino women are more Democrat than Republican. But the Latinos, blacks, and they are much less pro-Trump. So we'll have a split in the military.
It's interesting.
So it's dangerous. It's dangerous. The U.S. will be a very different country this year and next. So the margin counts, and we don't have to worry about our problem until we get cleared on this problem.
Okay, thank you. My next question is also to Keisha. Earlier you mentioned about your long-serving, I recall 10 years in United Nations. So you do understand how United Nations work. In fact, that our government, or President Lai in particular, is now also trying to influence the United Nations. Perhaps you can try to share with us. I don't know whether you are aware that there's a resolution called 2758. Basically, it's recognizing one China. But then the United States now, or William Lai is saying that, yes, one China, PRC, one China. But Taiwan is not that one China. So we are just trying to maneuver it. What the Suu Kyi, in the past proposed what he called the strategic the vagueness. But then what Taiwan government is now pushing is strategic clarity. Taiwan is a sovereign, the country status. What's your view from your understanding about United Nations?
Well, I must say I'm not quite sure. I'm a bit confused about this efforts of Taiwan to amend the UN resolution. It's obviously a UN General Assembly resolution. Well, for a start, it's impossible to amend that resolution in the UN Security Council because China has a veto. So that's the Security Council is out. Now, even in the General Assembly, any efforts to change a resolution against the wishes of the government of China will fail. Because for a simple reason, that if you give the countries of the world a choice, do you want to vote in favor of a resolution that pleases Taiwan and angers China? What do you get? What do you get out of it? And at the end of the day, China's standing in the global south has never been higher. You see that in the way that the African leaders went to Beijing for this conference. Even in Latin America, China's influence today is incredibly high. So I'm a bit puzzled by the political naivete of the people who are trying to push to amend a resolution in the United Nations. But nonetheless, maybe it's worth for them to try. Because when they try, they will fail so spectacularly.
Maybe they do not try to amend, but try to interpret it in a different way.
No, I mean, there's no point interpreting for yourself. You have to get the countries of the world to explain and understand the meaning of that resolution. But if any goal is to sort of ask countries to choose, do you favor an independent Taiwan? The vast majority of countries in the world will not support an independent Taiwan because they have already signed to a one China policy, and they'd be happy to work with the Taiwan that exists today. They're happy to work with the status quo. But if you try to change the status quo, any change will leave Taiwan worse off and not better off, because countries in the world are not going to support this. And this is a fundamental major reality. And I also emphasize that you also are living in a world where the influence of the West overall is coming down. I mean, very sadly. I mean, I say this out of sadness because I've seen how Europe has diminished dramatically on the world stage. I mean, if you want to understand why countries will not, for example, if you ask them to choose even between China and Europe, in 1980, the combined GNP of the European Union economies was 8 times bigger than China. Now, Europe and China are about the same size. By 2050, Europe's combined GNP will be half the size of China. So, clearly, everybody's got to adjust to a rising China. And I think if Taiwan's got to understand, that doesn't mean, by the way, I'm going to emphasize this, that Taiwan has to kowtow to China or Taiwan has to sacrifice itself. No. But Taiwan's got to be geopolitically extremely shrewd and cunning in managing a difficult geopolitical environment. And any kind of political naivete is very dangerous for the people of Taiwan. You must understand the real state of the world as it is, and not as a state, not the kind of, you cannot afford to have wishful thinking in geopolitics. And by the way, if just as an aside, let me mention, you asked about what Asia's geopolitical future also here. Most people in Taiwan are not aware that one key reason why there has been no major war in East Asia for 45 years is because there's an organization called ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that has done a remarkable job of being able to convene all the great powers to come and attend ASEAN meetings every year. And that ASEAN provides the opportunity for everyone to talk to each other. And this is an incredible contribution by ASEAN to the peace of Asia. And the sad part is, most people in Taiwan don't even know this. But this is your geopolitical environment. You must understand what are the forces that can lead to a war.
We are excluded. We are not in RCEP. We are not in CPTPP.
Yeah. But I think this is where you got to understand the forces that I play.
Following on that, very interesting. You mentioned Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and I myself, in particular, the organizer of the event, set up a organization called SIA, Southeast Asia Impact Alliance. And a lot of things not only happened in cross-strait in Taiwan lately, but also more so in Southeast Asia, in particular Philippines, South China Sea. So there are people seeing now that what's happening in South China Sea probably is even more dangerous than Taiwan. Do you want to comment on that? People say maybe some war or whatever confrontation going out there, and then and also we are in the conjunction of U.S. election, and then it's the things out of control, and the U.S. is too busy on its domestic election, cannot control it, and Taiwan may be in danger. Well, what's your view?
Well, I would say that the South China Sea, there are some potential problems. There have been skirmishes. You've seen the skirmishes between China and the Philippines. Although I want to add a very important point here. Neither China nor the Philippines has fired a gun, which is very significant, This is something you must notice. The weapons that are being, you showed us the pictures of Ukraine. You showed us the picture of Gaza. How would they look if they use water cannons instead of real cannons, right? So the reason I emphasize that dimension is that the Asians know how to exercise restraint, and they exercise restraint in that area. So South China Sea, there are challenges, but again, remember that we've had these challenges for several decades now, and China has had difficulties in Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, and until recently, there were no incidents. There is, but I can tell you that in the back room, there is a lot of diplomacy going on. A lot of diplomacy. And the most distressing statistic that was given by Suu Kyi is that you used to have 20 channels of communication with China, and now you have 0. That is incredibly dangerous, because you must always establish your channels of communication before a crisis. Don't wait for the crisis to come and set it up. And by contrast, so you understand the difference, among the ASEAN countries, and ASEAN is the most diverse region of planet Earth, we have over 1,000 meetings a year. Over 1,000. Can you imagine every day the face-to-face contact and the trust and confidence in each other that is built up by these constant meetings? So when you go from 20 meetings to having 0, you are creating a very dangerous, vulnerable point. And that's why ASEAN, in many ways, teaches the rest of the world how to do things.
Yeah, it is very interesting that you mentioned ASEAN. Our government has this 新南向政策 New Southbound Policy in the out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore is neutral. And Philippines are pro United States, pro American, but the other 8 are pro China. So the only country that Taiwan now feels comfortable doing business with in Southeast Asia is Philippines. So I heard from my contact say, "Oh, very bullish on Philippines," but then all the other countries simply because they are doing business or slightly toward China, or government feel hesitated to do business with them. So I just want to explain.
But I have to qualify that. The other 8 are not pro-China. In fact, most of the 10 ASEAN countries want to be good friends with China and good friends with the United States.
Neutral.
And so far, we have succeeded. And and by the way, there are enormous reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States in Southeast Asia, by the way. Southeast Asia is not anti-American. Southeast Asia is very friendly. In fact, when American congressmen and senators come to visit Southeast Asia, they get a very warm welcome. Now, in the case of the Philippines, you must also remember that when they had President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, she was pro-China. When they had President Aquino, pro-US. They had President Duterte, pro-China. President Marcos, pro-US. So, when you have
every 4 years.
When you have a country that swings like that, it can create some confusion. So I actually tell my Filipino friends that in geopolitics, you must work out a consistent bipartisan policy. And the wisest people in Southeast Asia, wisest country is Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, they have a saying that to become a leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China and you must be able to get along with China. If you cannot do both, you cannot be a leader of Vietnam. And that's what the countries in Southeast Asia also are trying to do. So, in diplomacy, a lot can be achieved if you're careful, subtle, and sophisticated in your approach and not black and white in doing your things.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification and the great insight. I want to ask you the last question before I open to the floor. We talk about, you also talk about the decline of the West, the rise of Asia, and the decline of America, United States, and the rise of China. We can see in so many cases, technology. The Apple just launched iPhone 16, and Huawei launched a new folded three-way. The cell phone that is unparalleled, and then the BYD that now is already way ahead Tesla, and then and also if you look at the space, the U.S. is in trouble. 2 of their astronauts stuck in the space, and the cannot 8 days mission become 8 months nightmare, and then but these are rising China, the inevitable trend. How will U.S. counter that? And Taiwan is in particular in a sensitive position because the only thing China is maybe not so good is chips, semiconductor. Taiwan is very strong. The U.S. also trying to control that. So what I'm seeing is the first question. This Asia rise seems inevitable, and we are very tricky in the extremely sensitive part. Taiwan is a very sensitive period, and Taiwan with the great technology of semiconductor chips also caught in between. What's your advice to Taiwan?
Well, I must emphasize that when I talk about the decline of the West, it's a relative decline, not absolute decline. I mean, the Western countries will still remain wealthy countries. They're not going to go into poverty. But the relative share of the global GNP is shrinking. And also when I talk about Asia, it's not just about China. You have 1.4 billion people in China. You have 1.4 billion people in India. And India is going to do very well. The Indian economy is already the 5th largest economy. It will be the 3rd largest economy by 2030. And then you have ASEAN with 700 million people. So it is a combination of what I call the new CIA. China, India, ASEAN.
Wow, CIA.
CIA. The new CIA that is happening. And so on your question of technology, it's very clear that TSMC must retain the trust and confidence of the US government. Very important. Because, if you lose it, then people in Washington, D.C. may advocate crazy options. You had the former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm sure you know what he said. He said what the United States should do if in case China invades Taiwan, the United States should bomb TSMC, destroy it completely so that China gets nothing. Now that's a very irresponsible statement by an American leader. But it shows you, therefore, how you got to be geopolitically sophisticated. And in the case of TSMC, because the United States regards it as so important, you have to retain the trust and confidence of the United States. But on the other side, I've said this in an article which I published with the former president of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Tony Chan. All the efforts to stop China's technological development cannot succeed. Because China has shown time and again that when you try and stop China, China overcomes it. They try to stop China from having nuclear weapons. China developed its own nuclear weapons. United States refused to cooperate with China in outer space. China set up its own international space station. And as you can see, right now, Chinese astronauts can travel out and back more easily than American astronauts can, which is quite a remarkable change. So in this game, therefore, what we need to do is very gradually and slowly persuade American policymakers that all their efforts to try and stop China are not going to work. Instead, what we should all be doing is learning to work with a new China that is strong and powerful. And the good news is that at this stage, the Chinese leaders are happy to work with the rest of the world to create a rules-based multilateral order that will work in the interest of all powers, including United States, including China, including Southeast Asia, and everyone else. So we still have the opportunity to have a better world if we press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest.
Thank you so much for the good advice. We're now open to questions. We have an extremely intelligent, inquisitive audience here. Anybody would like to, please raise your hand. 工作人员准备好麦克风，看看问问题。We have anybody would like to ask questions? Yes, Paul. 前面麦克风在前面，工作人员跑过来。
I would like to ask a question to Kishore. Okay, you are Indian, living in Singapore, Singapore citizen. I would like to ask a question: what do you view on China and India in the future? Okay, it seems to me they are not get along very well, and a lot of border incidents. Okay, what's your view? Do you think that China and India will get along in the future, or it is because U.S. is pushing India against China? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you that I share your concern, Paul, about the future of China-India relations. Because China-India relations today, they're not bad. They're very bad. Unfortunately, relations were quite good until about, I would say, 4.5 years ago. They were both, in fact, the two leaders who had spent more time meeting each other was the Prime Minister of India, Modi, with President Xi Jinping. But unfortunately, there was an incident in June 2020 in Galwan at the border between China and India where Chinese and Indian soldiers died. And that has set back relations between China and India quite badly. But having said that, I think both sides also realize they have to keep their relations stable. So, for example, even though there are no bilateral meetings between the Chinese leader and the Indian leader, they meet regularly in multilateral settings. So they meet at meetings of G20, they meet at meetings of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS. So there are ways and means. So I think as of now, especially after the election of Prime Minister Modi, Now I think both sides are going to try and see if they can stabilize the relationship a bit. India and China will never become close friends. But if we can just have a normal working relationship, then I think that would be okay. That's the best you can aspire to have.
有下一个问题，请举手。We have the next. Oh, at the end, 最后面，刚才戴眼镜那位先生。对，就这位先生。麻烦您站起来，让他能看到。
Well, I have a question for Joanna. I think for Asian country, you're saying that you can be friends with both China and the U.S. at the same time. What's your view on the Malacca Strait? Would that be a point of contention in case right now we have economic war and also maybe some tension in Taiwan Strait? But should the case be maybe the military confrontation start to heat up? Would Malacca Strait be a point of contention? I have a second question, but that's for short. For us, we are not in a position of power, not in Taiwan, not in the US, nor in China. So for people like us, more pragmatically, how do we position ourselves, I mean investments-wise, to navigate this tough water for the next 10 years?
Street. I worked in Singapore for 7 years. Malaysia is my second home. I go all the time. Of course, it's one of the major choke points in the world. So when we look at choke points in the world, actually a lot of them are inflamed. Look at Suez Canal, look at the southern tip of the Red Sea, and so on and so forth. So if there are additional tension, because India is also working in occupying one of the islands next to the Malacca Strait. So if there were additional tensions, I think the other plans will be executed or accelerated, such as the Thailand Canal Plan or other plans to bypass the Malacca Strait, which will be quite terrible, to be frank, for Singapore as a very major harbor and free port for the world trade. But there will be other plans, especially for oil and gas transportation and the lifeline of all the transportation. So now if we look at the world around us, there are 3 or 4 major choking points. One is Taiwan Strait, the other is Malacca Strait. And these two, if going into any kind of trouble, then the United States has a new thesis. This is a new playbook. It didn't happen before. The new playbook is the tension across Taiwan Straits is jeopardizing world economy and jeopardizing the flow of goods across the world. And that would be another way of getting international involvement for a potential conflict in Taiwan Straits. And may I just add, this is a new playbook. It didn't happen before. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Next question, please. Oh, yes. Sorry.
Yes. Your question, what can people like you do if you have no influence? And I would say it's very important for the public in Taiwan to also understand why is Taiwan in such a dangerous situation. The people must understand this. And some effort must be made to educate them. Because what is tragic here is that it's so easy to avoid war in Taiwan. Very easy. Right? Keep the status quo. But why risk it then? Why try to nibble away and try little things here, little things there, when they will not in any way enhance your security and in fact endanger your security. So Taiwan needs to exercise a tremendous amount of strategic discipline and being extremely careful if you want to preserve the peace here. But the people must be aware of it. So the people must also be told. And here the advantage we had in Singapore is that the founding generation of Singapore's leaders, and I discussed that in my memoirs, Living Asian century, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, they were geopolitical geniuses. And that's how I learned so much from them. And they understood what you need to do, when you need to speak out, and when you need to keep absolutely quiet. Just say nothing. And quite often, in many diplomatic situations, saying nothing is the best thing to do. So Taiwan should therefore learn to take an extremely low profile and be very, very careful of people who fly here claiming they want to defend you. I mean, Nancy Pelosi did an incredible amount of damage to Taiwan. There's nothing positive that came out of her visit, except that she became famous in the United States. So if people like that come to help you, be careful. They only want to use you as a stepping stone for their personal needs. And if you suffer, that's of no consequences.
We have time for one last question, if there's any. Over there. 前面这边拿麦克风过来，工作人员。
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Mahbubani. If China take over Taiwan in the future, will there be a big impact on the geopolitical structure, either in Asia or in the world? And do you think United States can afford that big impact?
Yeah, the question is that if China does take over the Taiwan, the impact will be a tremendous phenomenon. Like Nikki Haley say, 10 trillion. Can U.S. afford not to look into the situation? Basically, not to protect Taiwan, to let China invade Taiwan. The consequences will be the unbelievable.
Well, I think certainly the United States will be happy to provide weapons, logistics, and so on and so forth. But will the United States send its soldiers to come and defend Taiwan? And up to now, there has been a very clear implicit understanding among all the nuclear powers that their soldiers will not confront each other on the battlefield because there's a danger of escalation leading to a nuclear war. And even in the case of Ukraine, there is actually a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegitimate under international law. If the United States may want to try and support Ukraine directly, but they understand very clearly that if they put US soldiers fighting Russian soldiers fighting American soldiers, it will lead to escalation and maybe a nuclear war. So since China is a nuclear power and the United States is a nuclear power, the likelihood of American soldiers coming in is very, very low. And in a sense, basically, you will be on your own.
Thank you. With Kishore's remarks, I think all of us learn a lesson. I think we need to think hard, not just ourselves, but our companies or government leaders. I want to thank you once again. We are coming to the end of today's event. Kishore and Professor Suchi and Jonah are coming to this event. I want to thank my co-organizer, the K.D. Lee Foundation and the Fairwind Foundation, and most of all, I want to thank all of you. All of you care about politics. You made today's events happen. I think this is we don't have an answer, but we do have a lot of thinking. I think the key things are to avoid war, and we are seeking peace. And Kishore's recommendation is even for U.S. and China is to cooperate rather than confront. We all learned a great deal. Once again, 再一次热烈的掌声给他们。And thank you, everyone. This concludes today's event. Kishore needs to go to the airport now.
头告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。